Hello everyone, this is Dr. Kim's Scholarship and Journey. Welcome to my channel. This time we'll study the parable of the unjust steward or dishonest steward. So this parable is found only in Luke, but as many interpreters have hard time to understand it because it involves the ancient practice of usury. And so we'll see what this parable is about. So the overview, the substance of the story is usury practice. Usury practice is not good, right? Usury practice means if you have resources or money or crops, right, you lend it with a high, in exorbitant, right, prodigious rate of interest. That's not fair, not good, right? So probably this manager called the steward, right, in this parable was doing that kind of a usury practice. With whose money? With his master's crops, right? He did not own his own things, but he was working for his master. In doing so, he was involved, okay, in usury practice. So in this case, certainly his master did not know about this usury practice because this master steward doing that in his own way, and he expropriated, the customers of his master. So that's an issue somehow. Okay, we'll see what's going on here. His master knew about this unjust practice because some people complain about it, right? In exorbitant, unacceptable high interest rate. So his master was unhappy because otherwise his business would be eventually, disappearing. So he had what? He means here the manager had a crisis, and he might lose his job, right? So he was worried about that. So finally, he decides to cut back the amount of the debt for his customers, the master's customers, so that he expects to find a continual living among them. In other words, he would not be treated so badly, right, by the customers he dealt with after he was fired. So he is devising kind of a tactic, right? It's kind of a really surviving strategy at the brink of, right, his collapse. And at the end, actually, at the end of the story, very surprisingly though, the master commends his master, saying, you acted shrewdly or wisely. That's interesting. So we need to find out what is the basis of this master's commendation of his, manager. So first of all, we need to read carefully this parable. Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. And charges were brought to him, right? Charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. Squandering his property means he's not doing a good job to his master, right? Squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what's this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management. Your management, what did you do? Because you cannot be my manager any longer. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? Right? He's going to be fired. He feels that. He knows that. Why? I'm not strong enough to dig and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I'm dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. It's kind of a surviving strategy. So Summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Oh, cut it by half." Then he asked another, "And how much do you owe?" He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill, make it 80. And his master commanded the dishonest manager. He was dishonest in what sense? We'll find out. Dishonest manager, because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. Probably verse 8b, maybe not coming, not part of the original parable. Probably very strong, Lucan addition. So we'll see briefly what this parable is about, and we will need to reflect on, the insights that we gain from this parable. First of all, we have to ask, what's wrong with this manager, right? What charges were brought to him? Obviously, this parable does not give us very specific reasons for the charges that were made to him or against him, right? We don't know, but probably he was engaged, right? He was engaged in usury practice, using the master's crops or property, right? He lent that to the customers of the, rich man. So he expropriated the customers. He took some money, right? Interest into his pocket. So probably usury practice was the problem with this manager. So did he lend the master's money with usually high interest rate to his customers? If so, he was unjust, certainly, right? He was not supposed to do. He had to follow the agreed upon or, general usual interest rate, acceptable rate in the community. But somehow he was notorious, right? He did not follow the convention of interest rate. So people probably complained about him. That's why, his master heard, about this. So what he, did was actually he harmed the master's reputation and expropriated his customers, right? He filled his own pockets, but otherwise, the customers in the village or community and the rich man, they're all somehow ruined. Then why did the manager decide to cut back the amount of debt for the master's customers? The reason here is given so clearly in the parable, because when he is fired, he knows he will be fired for sure, which means what? He acknowledges that he did something wrong, right? So he knows he will be fired sooner or later. Once that happens, he's thinking that he wants to survive. He wants to live continually. How? Then he thought that he needed the support of a welcoming up, right? Welcoming by these people, right? So he wants to survive after he is fired. Okay. So he decides to gain favor, right? Favor, find favor from his customers. So he cut back by half, 20%, like that. Why did his manager command the manager. Why did his master, right, command the manager? I think the reason is not, given clear in this parable, but we can think of two things. First of all, his reputation was restored. That's very clear. His reputation was destroyed earlier because this manager, right, used the money, all things the master had, doing business in the name of who? The master, right? The manager is nothing in that regard. Okay, he was using the master's crops and money, right, and doing business in his name, the master's name. So people in the village, right, complained about this. So the master's reputation is being restored by what? Correcting, right? Or rectifying the interest rate and cut back the debt by half, like that. So the master's credit or reputation is being restored with this rectifying, right, job done by the master steward, the manager. And also eventually, guess what? The master's usual business may continue to be usual, right? It can go on with this rectification, right? Otherwise, there'll be no business at all. So from the master's perspective, right, that is the best thing, because he wants to continue with his reputation. He wants his business to go as usual. That's master's perspective. So he commended his, manager. In the end, we see all winners here. That's interesting. They're all winners in the parable at the end. The master's reputation is restored. He could get his business going as usual. The manager did not lose his job, right? Did not lose his job. And he got some credit from, the village people, because he cut back the debt. Anyway, so he did not lose his job. And the customers, right? Because their debts were reduced. That's also a good thing, right? So as you see here, what can we learn from this parable? Certainly, right? One very important lesson is, right, while you are doing your job, right, you should think about whether your business is a fair practice. Fair practice. I think that is important. And if you don't do a fair practice, then what? Some people will be harmed, right? So you have to think about, what kind of people you are living with, whether your business practice is fair enough, right? All you're doing, right? Whatever you do is fair-minded, fair enough. I think that is the first thing you have to think. And the other thing is that, oftentimes, Luke's gospel is not very much radical enough to challenge the system. So in this parable, as you see, all are winners, but otherwise there's no harsh criticism of, usury practice itself or the system itself somehow, right? The question is why there are poor people, why there are some people who have to depend on, right, borrowing all the time, right? Why there is a hierarchy, unequal business, all this kind of, practices in society. What's wrong with the system itself? Capitalist system, or in ancient times, patron-client system, right? So slaves and people have to depend on the rich person. So in this parable, there are no questions about those things, challenging questions. Just kind of emphasis here is that what, just let the system go, right? With just acceptable rate of interest. Otherwise, there's no harsh criticism of the system itself, or specifically, the usury practice. Even the master here did not point out the problem of a usury practice. Probably he was very much concerned with his own reputation in his own business, right? But as we, as readers, have to think about, what is real justice for these people, right? What is real justice? Should they be happy with just cutback of, debt? What is real justice they need, right? That's a real question. But unfortunately, this parable does not give us that kind of a sense. So, this parable may not be coming from Jesus directly. We don't know. But certainly, this parable has good fit in Lucan Gospel, because Lucan Gospel as a whole does not challenge the Roman Empire, the system itself. Okay, that's another topic that we need to study. All right. On one hand, certainly Lucan Gospel is very much kind of a social gospel. As you see, chapter 4, Jesus says, reading Isaiah, right, scripture, he says, the Spirit is on me, right? I proclaim the good news to the poor, right? The release of the captives and so forth. Yes, there are very radical elements of the gospel in Luke, but overall, the atmosphere or the tone of the gospel is very peaceful, ironic, peaceful. The gospel doesn't challenge the Roman Empire and the system itself, rather emphasizing charity-based ethics, charity, rather than justice or equality-based ethics. So probably this parable has good fit in that Lucan theology, right? And let me finish here. Otherwise, as I just said, this parable is not easy and very difficult to understand. And I'll be back with the other parables, so otherwise I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe to this channel.